Hello, hello. My name is Ariel Jillian, and welcome to another edition of the Queen's Corner. And today we're going to be talking about why I no longer identify with Black or African American, and I am going to tell you why. Okay? So a little bit of back history about me is I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and I went to Washington State University and graduated with a fashion degree. Upon graduating, I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and I was actually in Teach for America for 2 years. After I graduated from Teach for America, I moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where I pursued my passion for fashion design. And 7, 8 odd years later, here I am as a business owner myself. I'm a fashion designer. So I come to these talks with free speech, one, because no one owns my voice. And I come to these talks with truth because I have no agenda on this except for getting to the bottom of certain truths, because I believe that truth really sets us free. Okay, so that's a little back history. I know there's a lot of details that goes into my past, but the one I want to really dive deep into is the term Black or African American. In one of my other videos, I stated how I asked my mom if she identified as Black or as African American, and she did not identify as either. She identified as Negro, and she says that I'm a Negro and I'll always be a Negro. Now, granted, my mom was born in 1963, and in 1963, the prominent identity of our skin tone was Negro. And this was also a term that was given to us by the government. If you don't know what the US Census is, you need to look this up. But when they started the census in the 1800s, they would start labeling families based off of where they believed they came from or where they came from. But the only people that they did not really identify where they came from was the American Indians, because they wanted to wipe the American Indians out. This was the Indians' land, and they wanted the land. So instead of stating that they were American Indian, they would put colored. Okay, and then after colored, it was Negro. And after Negro, it turned into Black. And in the 1960s and 1970s, that's when it turned into African American. Hence, my mom was born in 1963. The term African American, Afro-American studies didn't actually come into use until 1962, 1970s, when they were actually creating this new culture that had never existed before. So I don't think I really identified with African American until I went to college, because in college, that's where I wanted to find my people, right? I went to Washington State University. 2% Black is what they would call it at the time, what I would call it at the time, 2% Black. But there was a center for us, and it was called the African American Student Center. Okay, AASC for short. And then across the hall from that was the Multicultural Service Center, and that's where I worked. So not only was I very prominent in the African American Student Center, I was the vice president of Black Student Union. So I knew I wanted to be by my culture and learn more about my culture. But the problem with this is that we are learning about ourselves from people who do not look like us, and also from people who did not have our best interest in mind. Okay, the 60s were a very tumultuous time, and I kind of want to go into this a little bit because I believe this is where the narrative really switched. In the early days of Martin Luther King, and also Black prominent civil rights leaders, this was also the age where TV and broadcasting became to the forefront. Okay, And so it was a way to talk to communities all over in ways that they were never able to do before. So when we talk about civil rights and marching, it's crazy to think that our government wanted these things televised. Why would they want the civil rights televised? Why? And I really had to think about this for a minute. But the reason, I believe, one of the reasons why they wanted these civil rights movement televised was so that the narrative of we are impoverished, we are come from slavery, there is a power, we want to be integrated into these schools. They wanted it to seem like it was a bigger issue than it really was, because they wanted us to want their education. Yet, when we look at their education, one, it says we came from Africa, we were slaves, we were brought here on chains, 10 million of us were brought here in chains. It tells a different type of history. But because there was that fight for inclusion in the 60s, and it was so heavily televised, the generations that came after that, we only had that information, that televised information, to really base our facts off of. And so our imagination just spiraled down into this idea of what happened during slavery and us bringing. And so we started to really identify with being African American and taking on this made up history of our past, because we saw the televisation of what the 60s was supposed to be like, what the 60s looked like. But you have to understand who was in charge of these networks and the narratives that they were sharing with us. Like, anywho, I kind of spiraled a little bit. I will talk a little bit more about that in another video, but I do think that they made the civil rights movement look so big because they were hiding what the bigger issue was. Okay? Because we started going to these schools and started learning their education, they knew they had the upper hand even more, because they were educating our children. They educated my parents, my grandparents, and me. So it's just a lot to take in. But once I understand that, and I understand all of the propaganda and who was in charge of what we saw, because they could be in charge of what we saw in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. After the 90s and 2000s, when information started to go all over, they couldn't control what we was listening to, who we were watching, and what we were learning as much as we have the freedom to now. And so that's why I'm here talking, because I want you guys to start questioning everything and really look into your own history, because the truth will set you free. So I don't identify with Black anymore, because Black was a name given to us by the US Census for their paper genocide. They did not want us to believe that we were Indians. They did not want us to believe that this was our land. Okay, if we identified with African American, which is a misnomer, as I always say, you can't be identified as two continents. Even real Africans, they would call themselves what country they're from. So Ghana American, Tanzanian American, certain things like that. Why I don't prescribe to African American, and this took me a long time to unprogram myself, because I've been taught these lies for so long. But I went on a whole self-discovery journey to really see, like, am I African? who are these people from Africa, and why was my connection lost to them? Why was my whole family's connection lost to them? And through more self-discovery and more family discovery, we never had connection to them in the first place. We didn't. They wanted us to believe that this was not our land and that we didn't have a connection to it. When I see very intelligent, very smart people talk about being African American and talk about their version of slavery from America, I see where the disconnect is in our country. Because if we are truly from Africa, then we do not take ownership of this country. We don't feel like we have the power to take ownership of this country, even though everyone else would be an immigrant, considered an immigrant as well. So that's why I do not prescribe to being African American, because one, it's just not true. It was a lie made up in the 70s from other immigrants who wanted to place more titles on African American, place more titles on our community. Yeah, it was a lie. And it needs to die. And it needs to die. And we need to wake up and start speaking out about it. I'm not owned by anybody. I have no intentions but helping my community, which I have always loved. And I always know the difference between our community and others. And I just want us to be better and free and happier and healthier. Okay, so I identify now, one, I'm a child of God, as I love to always say, but two, I'm an American Indian. My roots are here in America. My roots really stop at Georgia and South Carolina, Cherokee Indian blood. And I'm fine with that. I'm happy with that. And I want to learn more about my family every day. And I wish you guys would too, because really it just boils down to learning about your family and not accepting what is in someone else's book or textbook or history book. Okay? Because our forefathers, American forefathers, did not become forefathers without killing off some other race, and that was the American Indians. And they couldn't kill us all. They just did a paper genocide. Okay, so here's coming from one of your favorite American Indians. I hope you learned something, and I hope you take what I said and, you know, take everything with a grain of salt and really test it in the spirit and see if it's true for you and your family. And have a blessed day.